Hello again, everyone. Welcome. It's good to be with you again. This is Dr. Yates, and we're continuing our discussion of the Christian Bible. And specifically, I want to look at the development of the canon, how the canonization process began and emerged and was finalized. So again, like I said before, I'm just fascinated by this. This is one of my deep obsessions, you might say, is biblical history and especially how we came to arrive and receive the Old and New Testament. I find it fascinating. Anyway, here's a chart. When you have time, just kind of go through it. I've tried to kind of show you the date ranges of the earliest fragments of the manuscripts of the New Testament that we have, and again, I know this is complicated, and I don't expect you to get it all at once, but take your time, and I think you'll find that it's very, very fascinating. The earliest manuscripts of the New Testament books date from the late 2nd century to the early 3rd century of the Common Era. Literary analysis of these texts themselves is often used and has been used to determine the dates, and some of the actual dates as the earliest go back to the mid to late 1st century. I think you can see that in this chart. The earliest works of the New Testament were the letters of St. Paul, the Apostle Paul. And it's been determined by looking at, again, the literary analysis, the historical record, things like that, and a huge amount of other ideas and tools, that the earliest fragment we have of Paul's letters is 1 Thessalonians. This was written around 52 AD. Or if you want to use the term 52 CE or 52 Common Era, that would be fine. There are explicit references to New Testament books in what we call extra-biblical texts that place these early manuscripts to around roughly 180, and position the Gospels in the 1st century as 1st century writings. But again, you can see by these colored lines kind of what the earliest could have been determined as. 1 Thessalonians around 180. That's the earliest fragment that we have, on down to some others. So, and then you can tell. We also have some significant dates. We have the death of Jesus around 30 CE. We have the destruction of the Hebrew temple in Jerusalem at 70 CE, about the same time that the Gospels were first starting to be written, or the first texts were being written. Then we have around 120, we have the Bar Kokhba revolt, around 130, 132 CE. And then you see where the earliest fragments come in. The point of this is really to kind of give you a visual representation of just the range of things that we're looking at. Now, we're not saying in this that First Thessalonians was written by any means in 180, much earlier than that. But the earliest fragment we have dates from about 180. Okay. Now here's again, and I know the print's rather small, but this graph kind of shows you in a much more hopefully linear and more visual and colorful way how the New Testament canon emerged and the process that it went through. And I won't go through all of that, but I would encourage you to take time and just zoom in and just go through and read each of these sections to really get a sense of how this work came to be and how it was developed and how it was canonized. I've also included a URL there if you want to get a bigger version of this slide. Feel free to do that. Just click on it and it'll take you there. But the point of this is that the process of canonization of the New Testament, as I said, was complex. It wasn't an easy thing or a simplistic thing, and it was quite lengthy. It took, roughly around 300 to 400 years. We're talking centuries. So just to give you a kind of a frame, think of today in the 21st century, and then think of, say, let's just throw out one of Shakespeare's plays. Okay, it was written in the 16th century, the 1600s, and so that was 500 years ago. Okay, so that kind of gives you a frame that how long this process took from the beginnings to a final finished culmination. It was essentially 400 to 500 years of activity here. So anyway, in the initial centuries of early Christianity, like I've said before, we have a multitude of manuscripts in circulation. And a good many of these manuscripts, though not all, of course, were considered by the early church to be inspired. But there was no single formally recognized New Testament canon in these first few centuries of the Christian movement. This process of canonization, you might say, could be characterized by a compiling of books that apostolic tradition had gradually passed down and considered authoritative in terms of worship and in terms of teaching. And as well as being just relevant to the historical situations which provided context for them, as well as being historically connected and resonating with the Old Testament. So again, this was such a long process. The New Testament, as I've said in other videos, didn't just appear magically before us in one form or in one version. And I think that often gets lost because it's not really discussed in church on Sunday mornings or in Sunday school. It's left pretty much up to specific study by interested individuals rather than talking about it in a congregation. Anyway, kind of go into this just a little bit more. The writings that were attributed to the apostles that were circulating among the earliest Christian communities weren't just the Pauline letters. There were many other writings. They were circulating at the same time as the letters of Paul, and possibly, we don't know for sure, possibly these were collected in various forms or in various manuscripts by the end of the first century. But the idea of a complete and clear-cut canon of the New Testament existing from the beginning, in other words, from the apostolic period or the early first century, just simply has no foundation for it. There's no foundation in history that ascribes to that. What we have is a process of assimilation and transmission that finally ended in a process of canonization. But here in this chart, you can kind of see some interesting signposts along the way. You can tell, here we have the crucifixion again around 33. We have the New Testament essentially starting to be written between 45 and 90, roughly. We have the death of the last apostle, John, in 101. And we have a big leap where we get a number of Gnostic Gospels that were written. We have some fragments that were written around AD 170. We have, like I mentioned before, Irenaeus citing all but 4 of the New Testament books around 180 AD. Then we have the Third Council of Carthage, which finally affirmed the 27 books of the New Testament in AD 397. But before that, we have St. Athanasius, early church father, listing for the first time the 27 books of the New Testament about 30 years before in AD 367. But it wasn't until almost 400 years that, from the beginning with the crucifixion of Jesus, that we have finally the official canon made by the Third Council of Carthage in AD 397. So that's, again, 4 centuries, a 4-century long process. Give you a little more specific timeline. The canon of the New Testament, like the canon of the Old Testament, is the result of a development of a process that was energized or stimulated by disputes and by doubts, both within and without the church. Disputes with doubters, skeptics, etc. There were a lot of doubts, floating here and yon about which texts were inspired or which were authentic or valuable to teaching and to worship. Sometimes, you could easily say that this process was slowed down at different periods by obscurities, by political apprehension, by natural hesitation, if you will. But this process was still ongoing. It ebbed and flowed. It went at various speeds, but it wasn't really, it didn't really reach its final official end, to be perfectly honest with you, until the rather dogmatic definition arrived at the Council of Trent, which was basically held between 1545 and 1563, which prompted the Protestant Reformation. So by the end of the first 400 years, we have the official 27 books of the New Testament canon, but it lingered on for even another 1,000 years before it was finally just stamped at the Council of Trent in the 1500s. So, okay. Along the way, we have some really significant church councils that met. The earliest was the Jerusalem Council in 50 AD, and the main determination here was that a person saved by faith, not by keeping the law. The Council of Nicaea, which was one of the most important councils, was in 325, and it affirmed the divine nature of Christ, of Jesus. Then we had the Council of Ephesus in 431, the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the Council of Constantinople, I'll get it out in a second, in 553, the first Council of Constantinople in 553, then the Second Council of Constantinople in 680, and finally the Council of Nicaea, a second much later council, much more important council, in 787. So that just kind of gives you an idea. Although Christians have thought that church councils determined what books were to be included in the biblical canons for the Old and the New Testament, it's more accurate to say that the councils recognized or acknowledged at least those books that had already gained some kind of prominence and some kind of mass usage among the various early Christian communities. In other words, when these bishops and these councils spoke, they were not defining something new. They weren't coming up with new ideas or new approaches. Instead, what they were doing was ratifying, approving what had already become a part of the church or become the mind of the church. That's a lot of people think that the church councils made all the decisions about the New Testament. Not necessarily. The New Testament was already floating around in different forms, but through this process it was finally arrived at in a condensed, or not condensed by any means, but a concise form. And to give you an idea, from the 4th century, we can say that there's existed pretty much unanimous viewpoint in the West concerning the New Testament canon. It's what we have today. The Council of Rome in 382 cites a list of books of Scripture that had been presented as having been made canonical, but this first council that accepted the present canon of the New Testament possibly had been the Council of Hippo in North Africa in 393 AD, but we have no written records of that. The acts of this Council of Hippo have just been lost. So if we go on this, the Council of Hippo in 393 approved the canon, and then years later, about a decade later, the Council of Rome says that here's the list that was approved back then. But again, you can see by this chart all the different personages and canons and translations and councils that affected the canon of the New Testament just in the first 4 centuries. Okay, so again, take your time, just kind of go through that if you're interested. I just think it's fascinating. All right, moving right along. I'm taking too much time here. I apologize. Now, one of the big things that most people assume, and by assume I mean they don't really know the history of it, but they assume that the Council of Nicaea, because of the Nicene Creed that we recite in church on Sundays, was the council that determined the books of the New Testament. Nay. That's not what that council did. Didn't even address the New Testament. In 325, you can just say 325 AD if you want, or 325 CE, Emperor Constantine I, who was emperor of the world and who had converted to Christianity, and this is a significant thing, gathered or commissioned the first Council of Nicaea, basically to come together and agree on what Christianity held. Okay. Again, up until this time, there were wide differences and opinions and beliefs among the early church in the first 400 years. So the first Council of Nicaea was a council of Christian bishops that convened in the city of Nicaea. And this was the first effort to really attain agreement or consensus in the church through an assembly that represented all of Christianity. Its main accomplishments, the main things that this council accomplished were it settled the issue of the divine nature of God and the divine nature of the Son, and the relationship between God the Father and Jesus the Son. The construction of the first part of the Nicene Creed, and it mandated the rather uniform observance of the date of Easter, and really the dispensing of early canons, as it were, of codices. some manuscripts, but not. It didn't address the books of the Bible. Okay, it basically approved, or for some, invented the deity of Christ, the creation of the Trinity. Reincarnation was also a part of that. It mandated the date for Easter. Arianism, to basically come to an agreement about the Arian controversy. So it had a lot of things on the agenda, but creating the canon of the New Testament was not one of them. Okay. Again, here's just a brief pictorial depiction of the compilation process. A brief summary of the Acts was read and approved and accepted by the Council of Carthage in 397, and the Second Council of Carthage in 419. And these councils were under the authority of Saint Augustine. And Saint Augustine is one of the most important church fathers of the Latin Church, the Roman Church. But it's essentially the Latin Church. We haven't had this schism yet. But even this council didn't completely settle the matter of canonization. Certain books were still questioned. These books were basically taken together and given the name Antilegomena, because they just weren't approved of yet. And probably the two most important books were the book of James and the book of Revelations. There was such wide dissension and disagreement upon those two books and their authenticity. Okay. And finally, bring it up a little closer. In light of this questioning of the canon, especially in the 16th century by Protestants, the Roman Catholic Council of Trent reaffirmed the traditional Western canon. In other words, the canon that had been accepted in the 4th century Council of Rome and Council of Carthage. So that makes the canon of Trent and the Vulgate Bible essentially dogma in terms of the Roman Catholic Church. But by the 5th century, the Eastern Church had come to accept the book of Revelation, and basically by that time, both the Eastern Church and the ultimately what would become the Roman Church had basically come into harmony or agreement with the canon. But as you can see from this final graph here, this takes you through and historically shows you when the Great Schism happened, which was in 1054. And then in 1066, we get the Norman conquest of Britain. In 1517, we have Luther's 95 Theses, which was the beginning of Protestantism. 1455, we have the Gutenberg press being invented and printing the Bible for the first time. And that is another thing to keep in mind, that up until then, up until the Gutenberg edition of the Bible, most people did not have access to these manuscripts or to the Bible as we would come to know it. In fact, most of the populace was illiterate. It was only after the appearance of the printing press that literacy really began to take on steam. And we could go into a whole lot of discussion about that and the implications of that, but some other time. But anyway, take a gander at this, and just, again, what I want you to do is just wrap your mind around how the New Testament came to be written and how it came to be transmitted, and how it finally came to be accepted in terms of canonization. All right. Thank you again. We will see you next time. Go forth and prosper. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.